They were laughing. At her mother's funeral, while she stood there, 8 months pregnant, wearing a dress she had sewn herself, her husband's family was laughing. Victoria Blackwood's voice cut through the silence like a knife. I told Preston, this is what happens when you marry beneath you. The woman couldn't even afford a proper burial. Colleen's hands trembled. Her own husband wouldn't even look at her. But here's what the Blackwoods didn't know. Here's what nobody knew. The poor seamstress they were mocking, she had been hiding a secret worth $100 billion, and every single penny now belonged to Colleen. For 6 years, they called her Charity Case, Project, the wife who married up. For 6 years, they chipped away at her confidence until she forgot who she was. For 6 years, they thought they were winning. But the moment Colleen discovered the truth about her mother, about her inheritance, and about why Preston really married her, everything changed. This is not a story about revenge. This is a story about a woman who finally found the door out of her own prison. And what she did next, the Blackwoods never saw it coming. Lesson and value statement. Sometimes the people who treat you as worthless are the ones who are truly bankrupt inside. Your value was never determined by those who couldn't see it, and walking away isn't giving up. It's choosing yourself. Meaning of the story, this story reminds us that real strength isn't loud. It's the quiet courage to leave what diminishes you and build what fulfills you. It's knowing that you deserve better, even when everyone around you says otherwise. And it's understanding that the greatest inheritance isn't money. It's the wisdom to know your own worth. They were laughing. At her mother's funeral, the Blackwoods were laughing. Colleen stood at the entrance of Patterson Family Funeral Home, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other gripping the doorframe for support. 8 months pregnant and dressed in a black maternity dress she had sewn herself, she watched her husband's family cluster near the back of the room like crows at a picnic. Victoria Blackwood's voice carried across the modest space with surgical precision. I told Preston, this is what happens when you marry beneath you. The woman couldn't even afford a proper burial. The words hit Colleen like a physical blow. Her mother's closed casket sat at the front of the room, surrounded by simple flower arrangements, white lilies, yellow roses, carnations and soft pink. Her mother had loved carnations, said they smelled like Sunday mornings. Colleen's hand moved to her belly. Press, release, press, release, press. The baby kicked against her palm, a tiny protest against the tension flooding through her body. She counted the kicks. 1, 2, 3. Her daughter already knew something was wrong. The funeral home smelled of furniture polish and artificial flowers. Soft music played from hidden speakers, something classical that her mother would have hated. Maggie Hayes had preferred country music and old hymns sung off-key in the kitchen while making breakfast. Preston approached her, and for one desperate moment, Colleen thought he might offer comfort. He looked handsome in his charcoal suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, his jaw set in that firm line she had once found reassuring. 6 years of marriage had taught her to read that expression differently now. My mother's right, he whispered, leaning close enough that she could smell his cologne, sandalwood, and money. This is embarrassing. Couldn't you have let us help pay for something more appropriate? Colleen stared at him. This was the man who had brought her wildflowers on their 3rd date. The man who had cried at their wedding. The man who had promised to love her in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer. It's what Mama wanted, she said quietly. Simple. Preston's jaw tightened. A muscle twitched near his temple. Everything about your family is simple. He walked away before she could respond. Not that she would have. 6 years of marriage had also taught her when to stay silent. The service began at 2 o'clock exactly. Colleen sat in the front row alone. The wooden pew creaked beneath her weight. Behind her, she could hear the Blackwoods settling into their seats 3 rows back, far enough to signal distance, close enough to be seen. Pastor Williams spoke about eternal rest and the promise of heaven. He had known her mother for 30 years, had watched Colleen grow up in the third pew of First Baptist Church. His voice cracked when he mentioned Maggie's famous apple pie, the one she brought to every church potluck without fail. She touched so many lives with her kindness, he said. Her hands were never idle, always sewing, always mending, always creating beauty from ordinary cloth. Behind Colleen, Sloane Blackwood whispered to her mother, "Can you believe she's wearing homemade at a funeral?" Victoria's response was barely audible. "The apple doesn't fall far." Colleen's fingernails dug into her palms. She focused on the casket, on the spray of white lilies draped across its surface, on the photograph of her mother smiling in her garden, dirt on her hands, joy in her eyes. When it came time for the eulogy, Colleen rose on unsteady legs. The walk to the podium felt like miles. She gripped the wooden edges and looked out at the gathered mourners. 37 people, neighbors, fellow church members, a few of her mother's sewing clients, and the Blackwoods, watching her like judges at a competition. "My mother's hands," Colleen began. Her voice wavered. She cleared her throat and tried again. "My mother's hands were her greatest gift. They sewed my Halloween costumes and my prom dress. They bandaged my scraped knees. They held mine when I was scared." She paused, swallowed. The baby shifted, pressing against her ribs. "Mama taught me that love isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up. Every day, with patience and kindness and grace. She showed up for everyone in this room at some point, and she never asked for anything in return." Behind her, Preston sighed. The sound was heavy with impatience. Colleen heard it as clearly as if he had shouted. "I don't know how to live in a world without her," Colleen continued, her voice cracking. "But I know she would want me to try. She would want me to be brave. She would want me to remember that simple doesn't mean lesser, that homemade doesn't mean cheap, that love doesn't require an audience." She looked directly at Victoria Blackwood as she said those last words. The older woman's expression remained fixed in polite neutrality. "I love you, Mama," Colleen whispered. "Thank you for everything." She returned to her seat. Her legs trembled. Her heart pounded against her ribs. The service continued. More hymns, more prayers, more condolences from people who had actually known and loved her mother. Through it all, the Blackwoods remained in their row, checking phones and whispering and waiting for it to end. When the final prayer concluded, the funeral director approached Colleen with an envelope. He was a kind-faced man in his 60s named Harold Patterson. He had handled her father's funeral 12 years ago. "Your mother left strict instructions," he said softly. "You're to read this alone. After." Colleen turned the envelope over in her hands. Her mother's handwriting spelled out her name in careful cursive. The paper was cream-colored and heavy. "Expensive. There's also a key," Harold added, "and an address." She was very specific about the timing. Before Colleen could ask questions, Victoria appeared at her elbow. "We should head to the reception. People are waiting." The reception. At the Blackwood estate. Because Victoria had insisted that Colleen's childhood home was too cramped for proper hosting. Because Victoria always insisted on everything. Colleen tucked the envelope into her purse. "I'll be right there with Feist." The drive to the Blackwood estate took 23 minutes. Colleen followed the winding roads through the Connecticut countryside, past stone walls and autumn trees and houses that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Her mother's old Honda felt out of place among the Mercedes and BMWs that would fill the circular driveway. She parked near the service entrance. Old habit. Victoria had once suggested that Colleen's car lowered the aesthetic value of the front approach. The estate sprawled across 3 acres of manicured lawn, gray stone walls, black shutters. A portico supported by white columns that Victoria claimed were original to the 1780s. Everything about the house announced wealth and history and belonging. Colleen had never belonged here, had never. 6 years, and she still felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Inside, caterers moved through rooms filled with people who had never met her mother. Crystal glasses clinked, laughter bubbled, the smell of expensive canapes mixed with perfume and furniture polish. Colleen moved through the crowd like a ghost. People offered condolences without meeting her eyes. Others avoided her entirely, gravitating instead toward the Black Woods, who held court near the fireplace. She found herself in the kitchen, alone among the catering staff. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, offered her a glass of water. "You should sit," the woman said. "You look exhausted." Colleen took the water. Her hands shook. "Thank you. I'm sorry about your mother." 3 words. More genuine than anything the Blackwoods had offered all day. Colleen was still standing there when Victoria found her. "There you are." Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. It never did. "Hiding in the kitchen. How appropriate. I needed a moment. You've had plenty of moments. Now it's time to perform your duties as hostess." "This is your house?" Victoria stepped closer. Close enough that Colleen could see the fine lines beneath her expertly applied makeup. Close enough to smell Chanel No. 5 and white wine. "I've been patient with you for 6 years," Victoria said softly, "but now that your mother's gone, there's no one left to pretend for. You were never good enough for my son. You were a project, a charity case he took on because he felt sorry for you." The words landed like blows. Colleen gripped the edge of the counter. The granite was cold beneath her fingers. "Preston chose me." Victoria laughed. The sound was light and musical, and utterly without warmth. "Preston chose a pretty face he could mold. Look how well that turned out." She gestured at Colleen's pregnant belly, at her homemade dress, at everything about her that didn't measure up to Blackwood standards. 8 months pregnant, Victoria continued. Still teaching at that little elementary school, still driving that embarrassing car, still pretending that love is enough. She leaned closer. "Love is never enough, dear. Money is enough. Status is enough. You have neither." Colleen opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The words were trapped somewhere between her brain and her tongue, drowning in 6 years of swallowed responses and forced smiles and peaceful compliance. Victoria patted her cheek. The touch was cold. "Do try to mingle. For Preston's sake." She swept out of the kitchen, leaving Colleen alone with her trembling hands and her racing heart and the terrible dawning recognition that she had been a fool. For 6 years. A fool who had believed in love and patience and the goodness of people who had never shown her any goodness at all. Her phone buzzed. A text from her best friend. "Oh, Roz, where are you? I just got here. These people are terrifying." Colleen found Roz near the back staircase, looking wildly out of place in her bright red dress among the sea of muted designer blacks. Rosalind Callahan had been Colleen's roommate in college. Her maid of honor. Her person. "Bathroom," Roz said firmly. "Now." They locked themselves in the powder room off the main hallway. Roz leaned against the sink and crossed her arms. "Tell me everything." And Colleen did. 6 years of small cruelties poured out of her, like water from a broken dam. The diet books Victoria gifted her every Christmas. The way Preston corrected her grammar in public. The way Sloane compared her to Preston's ex-girlfriend at every family gathering. The way they laughed at her mother's funeral. They were laughing, Colleen said, tears streaming down her face. While Pastor Williams talked about Mama's hands, they were laughing about the flower arrangements. Roz pulled her into a hug. Why do you stay? Colleen's hand went to her belly. The baby kicked, once, twice, a reminder of everything she was trying to build, everything she was trying to preserve. Because I thought it would get better. Because I thought once the baby came, they would what? Suddenly develop human emotions? I thought they would love her. I thought that would be enough to make them love me too. Roz's expression softened. Oh, honey, I know. I know how stupid that sounds. Not stupid, hopeful. There's a difference. Colleen wiped her eyes. Her mascara was ruined. Not that it mattered. Not that anything mattered right now except the envelope in her purse and the growing certainty that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Mama left me something, she said. Instructions. A key, an address I've never seen. Roz straightened. Well, what are we waiting for? I can't just leave. Your mother died. You can do whatever you want. Colleen considered this. The freedom in those words. The permission. Tomorrow, she decided. I'll go tomorrow. Tonight, I have to get through this. She survived the reception by staying close to Roz and avoiding the Blackwoods entirely. Preston found her once to ask why she was neglecting their guests. She didn't bother explaining that they weren't her guests, that none of this was hers, that she was merely a background character in the Blackwood family drama, tolerated but never truly welcome. That night, alone in the guest room, because Preston claimed her pregnancy made sleeping difficult, Colleen opened her mother's envelope. A key fell into her palm. Small, silver, old-fashioned, an address on a folded slip of paper. 37 Pemberton Lane, a place she had never heard of, and one sentence, written in her mother's careful hand. Forgive me for keeping secrets. Now it's time for you to know everything. Colleen read the words 3 times, then a 4th. On the 5th reading, she pressed the paper to her chest and cried until there were no tears left, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the curtains, until the baby kicked again, reminding her that tomorrow was coming, whether she was ready or not. The law office of Pemberton and Associates occupied a brownstone on a quiet street lined with oak trees. Colleen parked her mother's Honda at the curb and sat for a long moment, staring at the brass numbers beside the door. 37, just like the address on the paper. She hadn't told Preston where she was going, hadn't told anyone except Roz, who had offered to come but understood when Colleen said she needed to do this alone. The building smelled of old books and lemon polish. A receptionist with silver hair and kind eyes led her to a corner office where morning light streamed through tall windows. Walter Pemberton rose from behind his desk. He was a tall man in his 70s, with a neat gray beard and eyes that crinkled at the corners. His suit was expensive but worn, the kind of quality that aged well. Colleen, he said warmly, you look exactly like your mother did at your age. You knew her? For 40 years. He gestured to a leather chair. Please, sit. This may take some time. Colleen lowered herself into the chair carefully. The baby was restless today, shifting and kicking as if sensing her mother's anxiety. Walter opened a folder on his desk. I'm going to tell you something that will sound impossible. I need you to hear me out before you respond. Okay? He looked at her with something like compassion, something like grief. Your mother was Margaret Eleanor Hayes. She was the sole heir to the Hayes Technologies fortune. He paused. Which makes you, Colleen, the owner of approximately $100 billion in assets, properties, and controlling shares. The room tilted. Colleen gripped the armrests of her chair. That's not possible. Mama was a seamstress. She chose to be a seamstress. Walter's voice was gentle. She chose to raise you simply, away from the complications of extreme wealth. She wanted you to know who you were without it. $100 billion. The number was absurd, incomprehensible. It belonged in news headlines about tech moguls and foreign princes, not in a conversation about her mother, who had clipped coupons and shopped at thrift stores and taught her that wanting less was the secret to happiness. I don't understand. Walter slid a photograph across the desk. A young woman with Colleen's eyes stood beside an older couple in front of a sprawling estate. The young woman wore a graduation gown. She was smiling, but her eyes looked sad. That's your mother at 22, Walter said. The day she graduated from Princeton. Those are your grandparents. Harold and Eleanor Hayes, founders of Hayes Technologies. Colleen picked up the photograph with trembling hands. The woman in the picture was unmistakably her mother. Younger, polished, wealthy. But the smile was the same, the tilt of the head, the stubborn set of the jaw. Why did she leave? Because her parents prioritized money over love. They arranged marriages, demanded perfection, treated children as assets to be managed rather than people to be cherished. Walter's voice carried old sadness. Margaret told them she wanted to teach kindergarten. They said it was beneath her. She told them she wanted to marry for love. They said love was a luxury the wealthy couldn't afford. Colleen thought of Victoria Blackwood, of Preston's careful courtship, of the marriage that had felt like a job interview from the very beginning. She ran away. At 18, changed her name, built a life of chosen simplicity, but she never stopped watching over the company. She made decisions anonymously, guided investments, protected the legacy, even as she rejected the lifestyle. Walter smiled sadly. She was brilliant. The board never knew that their most valuable advisor was a seamstress in a small Connecticut town. The baby kicked, hard. Colleen pressed her hand against the movement and tried to breathe. But the sewing machine, she whispered, the old car, the tiny house, all those years of hand-me-downs and making do. All choices. Deliberate choices. Walter leaned forward. Your mother believed that money corrupted, that wealth without values was poison. She wanted you to develop character before you inherited a kingdom. A kingdom. $100 billion. Colleen thought of every time she had asked for something as a child and been gently redirected. Every time her mother had said, "We have enough," with that peaceful smile. Every time she had felt vaguely ashamed of their modest life, especially after meeting the Blackwoods. Her mother had been protecting her all along. There's more, Walter said. He handed her a small device, a flash drive. These are her journals. Digital, she wrote to you almost every day for 30 years. Colleen took the drive. It felt impossibly light for something that held 30 years of her mother's thoughts. She wanted you to have choices, Walter continued. Real choices. The kind she never had. The kind that money makes possible, but doesn't guarantee. He paused. The question now, Colleen, is simple. What do you want? She didn't know. She had no idea. For 6 years, she had wanted Preston to love her. She had wanted the Blackwoods to accept her. She had wanted to build a family in that cold, gray mansion with people who saw her as lesser. Those wants felt very far away now. I need time, she said. You have all the time you need. The estate isn't going anywhere. Neither am I. Walter handed her a business card. Call whenever you're ready, day or night. I made a promise to your mother that I would take care of you. I intend to keep it. Colleen drove to her mother's house in a daze. The familiar streets looked different now. The modest homes, with their small yards and chain-link fences. The elementary school where she had worked until her pregnancy made standing all day too difficult. The grocery store where her mother had shopped every Tuesday morning. Her mother had walked these streets by choice, had built this life deliberately, brick by brick, choosing simplicity when she could have had anything. The house was exactly as her mother had left it. Colleen unlocked the front door and stepped into the smell of lavender and lemon, her mother's scent, the scent of home. She wandered through the rooms slowly. Everything looked different now. The vintage sewing machine in the corner. She looked closer and recognized the name. Singer. Antique. Worth thousands. The paintings on the wall. She had always assumed they were print, but the brushstrokes were visible. Original. Signed by artists whose names she recognized from museum visits. Her mother had hidden in plain sight. Colleen sank onto the worn sofa. The cushions held her mother's shape. The crocheted blanket draped over the back still smelled of fabric softener and chamomile. She sat there for a long time. The afternoon light shifted through the curtains. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. A car passed on the street outside. When she finally moved, it was to walk through the house again, to touch things, to remember. Her mother's reading glasses on the nightstand, her slippers tucked beneath the bed, the spice cabinet in the kitchen with the recipe for apple pie still taped inside the door. Colleen traced the handwriting. Cinnamon, 2 teaspoons. Nutmeg, ½ teaspoon. Love, unlimited. Her mother had written that last ingredient as a joke when Colleen was 7. It had never been erased. She opened the refrigerator, found the leftovers from meals her mother would never eat. A casserole from Mrs. Patterson next door, a pie from the church ladies, the ordinary kindness of ordinary people who had loved her mother without knowing anything about billions or legacies or hidden pasts. Colleen sat on her mother's bed and held her pillow and let herself feel the absence. Not the money, not the secrets, just the empty space where her mother used to be. The grief came in waves, great crushing swells that left her gasping. Then moments of strange, calm, then more waves. She stayed until dark, until the streetlights flickered on and cast long shadows through the windows. Her phone had been buzzing for hours. Preston, Victoria, Sloane, messages wondering where she was, demanding her presence, reminding her of obligations and appearances and all the things that had seemed important yesterday. She ignored them all. Instead, she plugged her mother's flash drive into the old laptop and began to read. The first entry was dated 30 years ago, the day Colleen was born. My beautiful daughter came into the world at 3:47 this morning. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Perfect. I held her and cried because I finally understood what my parents never did. Love isn't about what you can give someone. It's about who you become because of them. I will spend the rest of my life becoming worthy of this tiny person. I will protect her from everything that hurt me. I will give her roots and wings and the freedom to choose her own path. I will love her without conditions or expectations. This is my promise. This is my purpose. This is everything. Colleen read through tears, entry after entry, year after year, her mother's voice in every word. When she finally slept, it was curled on her mother's bed, the laptop beside her, her hand pressed against her belly where her own daughter waited to be born. The next morning, she found the entry she had been dreading. Preston Blackwood proposed to my daughter today. She called me crying happy tears. But I am not happy. I had him investigated. His family is drowning in debt. Their wealth is mostly illusion, maintained by reputation and careful borrowing. They are not marrying my Colleen for love. They are marrying potential access. They think she has none. They are wrong. But I pray she never needs it. Colleen's hands shook as she kept reading. The wedding was beautiful. Colleen was radiant. But I watched the Blackwoods watch her, and I saw calculation where there should have been joy. I wanted to tell her everything, wanted to give her power, but she looked so hopeful, so certain that love would be enough. I couldn't take that away from her. Not yet. I told myself there would be time. There is always time until there isn't. There was more. 6 years of entries watching her daughter struggle, watching the Blackwoods chip away at her confidence, watching and waiting and hoping things would improve. The final entry was dated 2 weeks before her mother's death. I made a mistake keeping this secret. I see how they treat her, the way Victoria looks at her, the way Preston corrects her, the way she shrinks smaller every time I see her. I should have given her power years ago. I should have trusted her with the truth. I'm going to tell her everything. I just need the right moment. I pray I have time. She hadn't had time. A stroke had taken her in her sleep, quick and quiet and utterly unexpected. The doctor said she wouldn't have suffered. Small comfort. No comfort at all. Colleen closed the laptop. Outside, birds sang in the maple tree. A lawnmower droned somewhere down the street. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary neighborhood that had sheltered an extraordinary secret. Her phone buzzed again. Preston. Where are you? My mother needs to discuss the baby shower. She has concerns about your input. Colleen stared at the message for a long time. Then she typed her response. I'm at my mother's house. I'll be home later. His reply came immediately. Don't be long, and please change before you come. That dress you wore yesterday was inappropriate. She turned off her phone. For the first time in 6 years, Colleen Hayes Blackwood had a secret of her own. The days after the funeral blurred together like watercolors in rain. Colleen divided her time between her mother's house and the Blackwood estate, existing in 2 worlds that couldn't have been more different. At her mother's house, she read journals and sorted through belongings and discovered the woman behind the seamstress. At the Blackwood estate, she performed her role as Preston's wife and Victoria's tolerated daughter-in-law and prepared for a baby shower she hadn't planned. The contrast was devastating. We've decided on the Meridian Country Club, Victoria announced over breakfast one morning. Saturday the 15th, I've already sent invitations to the appropriate people. Colleen looked up from her untouched toast. I'd like to include some of my mother's friends. Victoria's smile didn't waver. What friends? The woman lived like a hermit. She had friends. People from church, her sewing clients, women who actually knew her. This is a Blackwood event. We can't have just anyone attending. Preston reached for the coffee pot without looking at either of them. Mother knows best about these things, darling. Let her handle it. Colleen thought of her mother's journals, of all the watching and waiting and hoping, of the power she had tried to give her daughter too late. My mother chose her life, Colleen said quietly. Unlike some people, she didn't need an audience to feel valuable. The words hung in the air like smoke. Victoria's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Preston's hand froze on the coffee pot. Even the housekeeper polishing the sideboard went still. Excuse me? You heard me. Victoria set down her fork with exaggerated care. I'm going to attribute that outburst to hormones and grief, but I suggest you remember your place in this family. What exactly is my place in this family? Preston finally looked at her. His expression was a mixture of confusion and irritation, like she was a computer program that had started malfunctioning. You're my wife, the mother of my child. What other place could there be? Colleen thought of 100 responses. 1,000. 6 years of swallowed words pressed against her teeth, demanding release. Instead, she stood up. Her chair scraped against the floor. "I need some air." She drove to her mother's house without conscious thought. The route was automatic now. Turn left at the stone church, right at the elementary school, straight past the grocery store, where her mother had shopped every Tuesday. Inside, she went directly to the sewing room, her mother's sanctuary. A small space filled with fabric and thread and half-finished projects. The vintage singer sat by the window, still threaded with pale blue silk. Colleen ran her fingers over the machine. The metal was cool and smooth, polished by decades of use. Her mother had sat here for hours, creating beauty from ordinary cloth, dresses and curtains, and Halloween costumes and prom gowns. She picked up a piece of fabric from the basket beside the machine, soft yellow cotton with tiny white flowers. Her mother had been making something, a baby blanket, judging by the size. For her granddaughter, Colleen pressed the fabric to her face and breathed in. The smell of her mother lingered in the threads, lavender and lemon, and the particular warmth of hands that had worked and created and loved. The tears came before she could stop them. She cried for the blanket that would never be finished, for the grandmother her daughter would never know, for the secrets that had died with a stroke in the middle of a quiet night. When the tears finally stopped, she sat at the sewing machine and tried to remember what her mother had taught her. The basics. How to thread the needle, how to guide the fabric, how to turn chaos into order, one stitch at a time. She worked for hours. Her stitches were uneven. Her lines were crooked. But slowly, imperfectly, the blanket took shape. When she finally looked up, the light had changed. Afternoon had faded into evening. Her back ached, and her eyes burned, and her belly felt tight, with Braxton Hicks contractions. But the blanket was almost done. She finished the edges by hand, the way her mother had taught her. Small, careful stitches, invisible when done correctly, a test of patience and precision. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Anyone can rush through something. The real skill is taking your time, doing it right, creating something that lasts. Colleen held up the finished blanket. It was far from perfect. The corners didn't quite match. One edge was slightly longer than the others. A professional seamstress would have been embarrassed, but Colleen's daughter would be wrapped in love and intention and the last project her grandmother had started that was worth more than perfection. The next day, she met with Walter Pemberton again. This time, she had questions. "Tell me about my grandmother," she said. "Eleanor, is she still alive?" Walter nodded slowly. "She's 89, sharp as ever, according to the nurses. She lives in the family estate in Boston." "Does she know about me?" "She's known about you since you were born. Your mother sent photographs every year, cards at Christmas, updates on your life." He paused. They never spoke directly. The wound was too deep on both sides, but Eleanor never stopped hoping for reconciliation. Colleen absorbed this. A grandmother she had never met. Family she had never known existed. "What about my grandfather?" "Harold passed away 15 years ago. Heart attack." "Your mother attended the funeral in disguise, sat in the back row, left before anyone could recognize her. She never told me. She protected you from everything complicated. That was her gift and her burden." Walter leaned forward. "But now the complications are yours to navigate. The company, the money, the family history. Your mother left you everything because she believed you were strong enough to handle it." "I don't feel strong. Neither did she. At your age. Strength isn't something you feel. It's something you discover when there's no other option." Colleen thought about this on the drive back to her mother's house, about strength and discovery and the choices that shaped a life. She found herself looking at everything differently. The modest homes with their careful gardens, the elementary school where she had taught second grade for 3 years, the church where her mother had prayed every Sunday, sitting in the third pew, singing hymns off-key. Her mother had chosen this life, had rejected billions for simplicity and purpose and love. What would Colleen choose? At her mother's house, she sat in the kitchen and opened the journals again. She had been reading them chronologically, but now she skipped ahead to the entries from the past year. Colleen came for dinner tonight. She looked tired. There are shadows under her eyes that weren't there 6 months ago. She says everything is fine. She's lying, but I don't know how to help her without revealing everything, without changing the shape of her life in ways I can't control. Another entry, 3 months later. Victoria called Colleen ungrateful in front of the whole family. I heard about it from Mrs. Patterson, who heard it from someone at the country club. My daughter stood there and took it, apologized for causing offense. My brilliant, beautiful daughter apologizing for existing. I have failed her. I tried to protect her from wealth and instead delivered her to people who see her as less than nothing. A third entry, 2 weeks before the end. I've made a decision. Tomorrow, I'm going to tell Colleen everything. I'll show her the documents, explain the history, give her the power to choose. Not because she needs the money, but because she needs to know she has options. She needs to know that walking away is possible, that there is a door in the wall of her prison, even if she chooses not to use it. Tomorrow. Her mother had planned to tell her tomorrow, but tomorrow had never come. Colleen closed the laptop and sat in the gathering darkness. The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a dog barked in the distance. Her mother had seen everything, had known about Victoria's cruelty and Preston's indifference and the slow erosion of Colleen's spirit, had watched and worried and finally decided to act. One day too late. The grief crashed over her in waves, not just for her mother anymore, but for herself, for the woman she might have been if she had known sooner, for the choices she might have made. She thought of her wedding day, the way Preston had looked at her, the way she had believed in forever. She thought of the first time Victoria had criticized her cooking, the way she had promised herself it would get better once the older woman got to know her. She thought of the first time Preston had dismissed her opinion in public, the way she had made excuses, blamed herself, tried harder, 6 years of trying harder, 6 years of shrinking smaller, 6 years of hoping that love would be enough to transform people who had no interest in transformation. Her mother had known, had watched it happen, had carried the burden of that knowledge alone. Colleen's hand went to her belly. The baby kicked, strong, insistent. "I won't let that happen to you," she whispered. "I promise, whatever it takes." The words felt like a vow, like the beginning of something new. She spent the night at her mother's house again. Preston called twice. She let it go to voicemail both times. His messages were irritated. Where was she? What was she doing? His mother wanted to finalize the baby shower menu. There were decisions to be made about the nursery. She was being irresponsible. Irresponsible. Colleen laughed out loud. The sound was harsh in the quiet house. She was the owner of $100 billion. She was sleeping in her dead mother's bed because it was the only place that felt safe. She was married to a man who saw her as a function rather than a person. And she was being called irresponsible. The absurdity of it settled around her like a blanket, like permission, like the beginning of rage. Colleen returned to the Blackwood estate the next morning with new eyes. Everything looked different now. The sweeping driveway, the manicured lawns, the gray stone walls that had always seemed so impressive. Now she saw the cracks in the foundation, the paint peeling near the windowsills, the slight sag in the front porch that no one had bothered to repair. The Blackwoods weren't as wealthy as they appeared. She thought of what Walter had told her: drowning in debt, reputation, and careful borrowing. She thought of her mother's journals, marrying potential access. Preston met her in the foyer. His expression cycled through relief and annoyance, and something that might have been concern if she squinted. "You didn't answer my calls. I was grieving. Your mother died over a week ago. At some point, life has to continue." Colleen stared at him, really looked at him. The man she had married, the father of her child. He was handsome. That hadn't changed. But now she saw the hardness around his mouth, the calculation in his eyes, the way he looked at her like she was a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be loved. "You're right," she said quietly. "Life does continue." She walked past him toward the kitchen. He followed. "Mother wants to discuss baby names. She thinks Margaret is too old-fashioned. She has some alternatives." Colleen poured herself a glass of water. Her hands were steady. "I want to name her after my mother." "That's not really your decision to make alone." "Excuse me? This is our child. A Blackwood. The name matters." "Margaret was a Blackwood. Your great-aunt." Preston's jaw tightened. "That's different. How?" He didn't have an answer. Colleen watched him search for one, watched the frustration flicker across his face when he couldn't find it. "Let's table this discussion," he finally said. Table it. His favorite phrase, the way he avoided every conversation he didn't want to have. In 6 years, she had never once won a tabled discussion. They simply disappeared into the void of things never resolved. "No." The word fell between them like a stone. "What?" "No, I don't want to table it. I want to name my daughter Margaret, after my mother, who just died." Preston's expression shifted. She had surprised him. In 6 years, she had never directly refused anything. "Colleen, be reasonable." "I am being reasonable. I'm being completely reasonable. My mother is dead. I want to honor her memory. What's unreasonable about that?" Before he could answer, Victoria swept into the kitchen. She was dressed in cream silk with pearls at her throat. Perfect, polished, predatory. "I heard raised voices. Is everything all right?" "Colleen is being emotional about the baby name." Victoria's gaze flicked between them. Her smile was patient and cold. "Of course she is. Grief does strange things to people." She moved to the coffee maker. "But we can't let sentiment override good judgment. The child will carry the Blackwood name for the rest of her life. She deserves something elegant, distinguished." "Like Victoria?" Colleen asked. The older woman turned. "If you'd like, I'd be honored." "I wouldn't." The words hung in the air. Colleen felt something shift inside her, a door opening, a wall crumbling. "I'm naming my daughter Margaret," she said, "after my mother, who spent her whole life being kind and generous and good, who made things with her hands and helped her neighbors and loved without expecting anything in return. I can think of no one better to honor." Victoria's smile didn't waver, but her eyes went hard. "You're being very dramatic, dear. I'm being clear. There's a difference." She left the kitchen before either of them could respond. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were shaking. But she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Alive. She felt alive. That night, alone in the guest room, she read more of her mother's journals. The early entries were full of hope and joy. Stories of Colleen's first words, first steps, first day of school. Detailed descriptions of small triumphs and tender moments. But as the years progressed, a sadness crept into the words, a worry that grew sharper with each entry about the Blackwoods. "Colleen told me today that Victoria suggested she lose a few pounds before the wedding. My daughter, who is healthy and beautiful and perfect, now examines herself in mirrors with critical eyes. This is how it starts. This is how they diminish us, bit by bit, suggestion by suggestion, until we can't remember who we were before. Colleen set down the laptop. She walked to the mirror in the corner of the room and looked at herself. 8 months pregnant, tired, puffy from water retention and too many tears. Her hair needed washing. Her skin was pale, but her eyes were her mother's eyes. Her hands were her mother's hands. Her stubbornness, which the Blackwoods called difficult, was her mother's stubbornness. She was not lesser. She had never been lesser. She had just forgotten. The days that followed were strange. Colleen moved through the Blackwood estate like a ghost, present but not engaged. She attended the baby shower planning meetings. She nodded at Victoria's suggestions. She let Preston think everything was normal, but inside, she was changing, reading, planning, preparing. Walter helped her understand the scope of her inheritance, the company, the properties, the charitable foundations her mother had built in secret, billions flowing into education and health care and environmental protection, a legacy of good hidden behind the facade of a simple seamstress. Your mother wanted to prove that wealth didn't have to corrupt, Walter explained. She wanted to show that money could be used for good without anyone knowing, without credit or recognition or praise. She succeeded. She did. And now, you have to decide what kind of legacy you want to build. Colleen thought about this constantly. In the shower, while eating breakfast, during the interminable family dinners where Victoria held court and Preston agreed with everything his mother said. What did she want her legacy to be? A week before the baby shower, she discovered something that changed everything. She was cleaning out her mother's home office, sorting through papers and files, when she found a folder labeled Blackwood Investigation. Inside were documents, financial records, private investigator reports, a comprehensive picture of the Blackwood family's true situation. The estate was mortgaged 3 times over. Preston's investment firm had been hemorrhaging money for a decade. The country club memberships, the expensive cars, the lavish parties, all funded by loans and credit and the careful cultivation of appearances. They were broke, had been broke for years, and her mother had known. The investigation went further. Before the wedding, Maggie had tracked every inquiry the Blackwoods made about her family. The questions asked around town, the background checks run on Colleen, the careful research into whether the Hayes family might have hidden assets. They had suspected something, had hoped for something, had married Preston to the quiet school teacher on the chance that there might be money somewhere. The final document was a letter from Preston Blackwood Jr. to an associate. A letter requesting information about Hayes Technologies and its ownership structure, dated 3 months before the engagement. The Hayes woman my son is pursuing may have connections to the tech sector, worth investigating before we proceed. Pursuing, like she was prey. Colleen sat in her mother's office as the afternoon light faded and the truth settled into her bones. She had never been loved. She had been assessed, evaluated, targeted. Her marriage was a business arrangement she hadn't known she was part of. The anger that had been building for weeks finally ignited, not hot and wild, but cold and focused, diamond hard. She thought of every time Preston had dismissed her, every time Victoria had belittled her, every time she had apologized for taking up space in their world. They had married her for money, money she didn't even know she had, money that they had failed to access because her mother was too clever, too careful, too protective. And now that mother was dead, and Colleen had options she never knew existed, she called Walter that night. "I need to understand something," she said. "The inheritance. Is there anything in the terms about my marriage?" Walter was quiet for a long moment. "Your mother added a condition 3 years ago. after a particularly bad Christmas, according to her notes. What condition? You cannot access the full inheritance while married to someone who treats you as less than you are. Colleen laughed. The sound was brittle. She built in an escape clause. She built in a choice. The condition doesn't require divorce. It requires honest evaluation. If you genuinely believe Preston treats you well, if you genuinely want to stay married, the inheritance remains yours. The choice is entirely yours to make. The choice was hers. For the first time in 6 years, something was entirely hers. The baby shower was 3 days away. Colleen moved through the preparations like an actress following a script. She smiled when expected, agreed when required, said nothing of consequence, but her mind was elsewhere, planning, calculating, preparing. She met with Garrett Sullivan on a Tuesday morning. The CEO, her mother, had appointed to run Hayes Technologies. A tall man with kind eyes and a firm handshake, he reminded Colleen of her high school principal. Serious, but not unkind. Your mother was the smartest person I ever knew, Garrett said. They sat in his corner office, overlooking the Boston skyline. She could have run this company publicly and been called a genius. She chose to be anonymous because she said, "Power corrupts visibility." What does that mean? It means she believed that the moment people know you have power, they start trying to take it from you, or use you to get it for themselves. He paused. She watched from the shadows, made suggestions that always turned out to be right, protected the company and its employees without anyone knowing she existed. Colleen looked out at the city below. Thousands of people going about their lives, working, hoping, struggling. How many employees? 47,000 worldwide, plus contractors and suppliers and partners. The ecosystem your mother built touches millions of lives. The weight of it pressed down on her, $100 billion. 47,000 employees, millions of lives. And she was 8 months pregnant with a failing marriage and no idea what she wanted. "I'm not ready for this," she admitted. Neither was your mother when she inherited it. Neither was her father when he built it. Nobody is ever ready for something this big. Garrett smiled. That's why we have teams, advisors, people who dedicate their lives to making sure the burden doesn't crush the person carrying it. My mother carried it alone. She chose to. You don't have to make the same choice. That evening, Colleen had her regular appointment with Dr. Crane. Her obstetrician was a soft-spoken man in his late 50s with gray at his temples and concern in his eyes. "How are you feeling?" he asked as he checked her blood pressure. "Tired?" "Overwhelmed. My mother just died. I know, I'm sorry. He made a note on her chart. "Any physical symptoms I should know about? Swelling, headaches, contractions? Normal amounts. Nothing unusual." He nodded, then paused. His eyes flickered to her arm. Colleen looked down, a bruise faint purple against her pale skin from when Preston had grabbed her last week, when she had said she wanted to stay at her mother's house for a few nights. "What happened there?" "Nothing. I bumped into a door." Dr. Crane was quiet for a long moment. His expression remained carefully neutral. "Colleen, I've known you for 7 months. You don't seem like someone who walks into doors." She didn't respond, couldn't. The truth was lodged in her throat like a stone. "There are resources," he said gently, "if you ever need them. People who specialize in helping women in difficult situations. No judgment, no questions, just support." "I don't need resources. Everyone needs resources sometimes." She left the appointment with a card tucked into her purse, a hotline number, a website, the name of a counselor who specialized in domestic situations. Not that she needed it. Preston had never hit her. Not really. The occasional grab, the too tight grip on her arm, the blocked doorway When she tried to leave a room during an argument, not real abuse, not the kind that left marks that couldn't be explained. She was rationalizing. She knew she was rationalizing. The voice in her head sounded like her mother's journals, like all the women who had stayed too long and made excuses and believed things would get better. But knowing and acting were different things. The confrontation came sooner than she expected. Dinner at the Blackwood estate. The whole family gathered around the long mahogany table. Roast beef and asparagus and a wine Colleen wasn't allowed to drink because of the pregnancy. Victoria was holding court, as usual. Something about a charity gala she was planning. The importance of maintaining appearances. The guest list that had to be perfect. Of course, we'll need to discuss what Colleen will wear, Victoria said. Last year's event was marred by her unfortunate choice of dress. We can't have a repeat. Colleen looked up from her plate. What was wrong with my dress? It was inappropriate. It was a black evening gown. It was off the rack. The table fell silent. Preston suddenly became very interested in his asparagus. Sloane smirked into her wine glass. Something in Colleen snapped. Clean and sharp, like a branch breaking under too much snow. I'd like to include some of my mother's friends in the baby shower. Victoria blinked. The change of subject was jarring enough to throw her off balance. We've already discussed this. No, you've discussed it. At me, I haven't agreed to anything. Colleen set down her fork. My mother had people who loved her, people who helped raise me. I want them to be part of celebrating her granddaughter. This is a Blackwood event. This is a celebration of my baby. Mine. I get to decide who comes. Preston cleared his throat. Darling, let's not make a scene. I'm not making a scene. I'm stating what I want. That's not the same thing. Victoria's smile was ice. You seem to be forgetting your place. Maybe my place isn't what you think it is. The words fell into the silence like stones into water. Ripples spreading, tension building. Preston stood up. Colleen, I think you need to lie down. The pregnancy hormones are making you emotional. I'm not emotional. I'm clear. For the first time in 6 years, I'm completely clear. She stood up too. Her chair scraped against the floor. I'm going to my mother's house tonight. I'll be back tomorrow. You can't just leave in the middle of dinner. Watch me. She walked out. Through the dining room, through the foyer, through the front door that had never felt like an entrance, only ever an exit. The drive to her mother's house felt like escaping, every mile putting distance between herself and the people who had never loved her, who had assessed and acquired and tolerated, but never loved. At her mother's house, she sat on the kitchen floor and cried. Great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. The baby kicked and kicked, protesting the disturbance. I'm sorry, Colleen whispered. I'm sorry, little one. I didn't know. I didn't know what I was bringing you into. She stayed there for hours, until the tears ran out, until her back ached from sitting on the hard floor, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the kitchen window. Then she got up, made tea, and started to plan. The gala was Victoria's masterpiece. 300 guests, crystal chandeliers, a string quartet playing Mozart in the corner, everything dripping with wealth and taste and the carefully cultivated appearance of belonging. Colleen stood in the entrance, 8 months pregnant in a navy blue gown that Victoria had approved, and felt like a fraud, an imposter, a poor relation playing dress-up. Preston's hand rested on her lower back, possessive rather than supportive. Smile, he murmured. People are watching. She smiled. The expression felt like glass on her face, fragile, liable to shatter. The evening proceeded as expected. Cocktails, small talk, subtle competition disguised as compliments, women assessing her dress, her jewelry, her swollen belly, men congratulating Preston as if the pregnancy were his achievement alone. Then Victoria took the stage. Thank you all for joining us tonight to support the Blackwood Foundation's commitment to excellence in education. Applause. Champagne glasses raised. As many of you know, this cause is deeply personal to our family. We believe in lifting up those less fortunate and providing opportunities to those who might otherwise struggle. She paused. Her gaze swept the room, landed on Colleen. This mission extends to our own family as well. When my son Preston married, he chose a woman from humble beginnings, a school teacher from a small town, a woman without resources or connections. We welcomed her with open arms because we believe that character matters more than circumstance. The room murmured appreciatively. How generous, how gracious, Colleen felt the blood drain from her face. Of course, the road hasn't always been easy. Adjusting to a different life is challenging, but we've supported our dear daughter-in-law through every stumble, every misstep, every unfortunate choice of wardrobe. Laughter rippled through the crowd, good-natured, complicit. And now, as we prepare to welcome a new generation, we're reminded why this work matters, why we give, why we open our hearts and our homes to those who need us. More applause, more champagne. Colleen stood frozen, smiling, dying inside. The speech continued, more pointed kindness, more generous condescension. By the time Victoria finished, Colleen had been painted as a charity case. A project, a testament to Blackwood benevolence. Preston squeezed her hand. See? Mother adores you. She excused herself to the bathroom, walked through the ballroom with her head high and her smile fixed, made it through the door before the tears started. Sloane was waiting at the sink. You look pale, her sister-in-law said. Is the baby okay? I'm fine. You don't look fine. Colleen splashed water on her face. Her makeup was ruined. Not that it mattered. Nothing mattered except getting through the next few hours without completely falling apart. Can I ask you something? Sloane's voice was different, softer than usual. What? Did you know? Before you married him? Colleen looked at her reflection, at the stranger in the navy gown with mascara running down her cheeks. Know what? Sloane was quiet for a long moment. Never mind. Forget I said anything. But she had said something, and Colleen filed it away, added it to the growing pile of things that didn't quite add up. She made it through the rest of the evening on autopilot, smiling, nodding, accepting congratulations on the pregnancy and condolences about her mother and all the complicated feelings that wealthy strangers felt entitled to witness. That night, alone in her mother's house, she hit bottom, the kitchen floor again, always the kitchen floor, as if sitting where her mother had sat might somehow bring her closer, might somehow provide answers. 8 months pregnant, orphaned, married to a man who saw her as furniture, wealthy beyond imagination, but trapped in a life that felt like slow suffocation. Who am I? She whispered to the empty room. The poor girl who married up? The secret heiress? The pregnant woman whose husband can't stand her? The daughter who didn't know her own mother? The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Outside, a car passed on the quiet street. She thought about her mother, about the choice Maggie had made at 18. Walking away from everything, building a new life from nothing. Could Colleen do the same? Could she leave? The thought was terrifying. She had been a Blackwood for 6 years, had learned to navigate their world, their rules, their expectations, had become a version of herself that fit into their framework. Who was she without them? She didn't know. That was the worst part. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped knowing who she was. 2 a.m. She couldn't sleep. The baby was restless, her mind was racing. She did what her mother always did. Made tea, chamomile, the same brand her mother had used, the same mug. Blue ceramic with a chip on the handle. The kettle whistled, the water poured, the steam rose. "I don't know what I'm doing, Mama," she whispered. "I don't know how to fix this." The silence didn't answer, but she stayed, sat at the kitchen table with her tea and her grief and her fear. The street light through the window cast squares of light on the linoleum. 12 squares lit, 12 squares dark. Her mother must have seen this same pattern 1,000 times, sitting right here, keeping secrets, loving her anyway. The baby kicked, once, twice, a conversation without words. "I'll figure it out," Colleen promised. "I don't know how yet, but I'll figure it out, for both of us." She fell asleep on the couch, woke at dawn with her phone lighting up with notifications. One caught her eye. An unknown number. "Your mother helped me once. I think it's time I return the favor. Lunch tomorrow?" Eleanor Hayes, her grandmother, the one she had never met. The woman her mother had run from 40 years ago. Colleen stared at the message for a long time. Then she typed her response. "I'll be there." The cafe was small and quiet, tucked away on a side street far from anywhere the Blackwoods would venture. Eleanor Hayes sat in a corner booth, watching the door. Colleen recognized her immediately, not from photographs, but from her own reflection. The same eyes, the same stubborn set of the jaw, the same hands, though Eleanor's were wrinkled now, spotted with age. She was dressed simply. Navy slacks and a cream blouse. Pearls at her throat, but small ones. Nothing ostentatious. "Colleen." Eleanor's voice cracked on the name. "You look exactly like her. Everyone keeps saying that." "Because it's true. Sit, please." Colleen lowered herself into the booth carefully. The baby was heavy today, pressing on her bladder and her spine and everything in between. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Eleanor said. "Neither was I." They sat in silence for a moment, two strangers connected by blood and secrets, and a woman they had both lost. "I was a terrible mother to Margaret," Eleanor said finally. "I prioritized legacy over love, expected perfection instead of accepting humanity. I lost my daughter for 40 years because I couldn't see past my own ambition." "She never talked about you." "She wouldn't have. The wound was too deep." Eleanor's eyes glistened. "I have no right to ask for anything. I'm not here to make demands or explain away the past. I just wanted to meet you, to tell you how sorry I am, and to offer whatever help you might need." Colleen studied her grandmother's face, looking for deception, for calculation, for the coldness her mother's journals had described. What she found was grief, raw and real and exhausted. "My mother left me everything," Colleen said. "I know. I helped her structure the trust. Anonymously, of course. She wouldn't have accepted direct help." Eleanor smiled sadly. "We communicated through lawyers for 40 years. It wasn't much, but it was something." "You knew? About the money? About her secret life?" "I knew she was building something good with what she inherited. I knew she was protecting you from the worst parts of wealth. I respected her choices, even when I didn't understand them." The waiter came. They ordered coffee. When he left, Eleanor continued. "Your mother believed that money was a tool, not an identity. She watched her own parents, watched me, make the mistake of letting wealth define everything. She wanted better for you. She succeeded." "Did she?" Eleanor's gaze was sharp. "I've heard things about your husband, about his family." Colleen's defenses rose automatically. "What things?" "That they treat you poorly, that you've lost yourself in their world, that you're repeating the very patterns your mother worked so hard to break." The words stung because they were true. Colleen looked away. "I'm not here to judge," Eleanor said gently. "I'm here because I failed my daughter, and I won't fail my granddaughter. Whatever you need, Whatever it takes, I'm here. I don't know what I need. Then let me ask you something. Eleanor leaned forward. What do you want, Colleen? Not what's expected, not what's safe, not what keeps the peace. What do you actually want? The question hit like a physical force. Colleen opened her mouth to answer and found she had no words. What did she want? She had spent 6 years wanting Preston to love her, wanting the Blackwoods to accept her, wanting to build a family in a house that had never felt like home. Those wants felt hollow now, borrowed, not really hers at all. I don't know, she admitted. I've spent so long trying to fit into their world that I've forgotten what my world looks like. Eleanor nodded slowly. Your mother felt the same way at your age. She didn't know who she was outside of her family's expectations. Running away was the only way she could find out. I can't run. I'm 8 months pregnant. You can't physically run, but you can stop running toward things that hurt you. You can start walking toward things that might heal you. Colleen thought about this, about the difference between escape and choice, about the door in the wall that her mother had tried to show her. Your mother added a condition to your inheritance, Eleanor said. Did Walter tell you? Yes. Then you know you have a choice, a real choice, not one imposed by circumstance or expectation, but one that belongs entirely to you. Eleanor slid a folder across the table. Colleen opened it. Documents, legal papers, the formal terms of her inheritance. My daughter must leave any relationship that diminishes her. She cannot access the full inheritance while married to someone who treats her as less than she is. Colleen read the words 3 times. Let them sink in. Her mother had built an escape hatch, had encoded permission to leave into the very structure of the money, had given her daughter the one thing she might actually need, a reason, an excuse, a way out that wasn't about failure or giving up, but about self-preservation. She knew, Colleen whispered. She always knew. She just hoped she was wrong. That evening, Colleen returned to her mother's house with a new clarity. Not certainty. Not yet. But the beginning of something that felt like direction. She spent the night reading the full terms of her inheritance, understanding what her mother had built, seeing the care and intention in every clause and condition. The money wasn't a gift. It was a tool, one designed to give her options without dictating choices. What she did with those options was up to her. For the first time since her mother's death, Colleen felt something other than grief and fear. She felt ready. The work began quietly. Small steps, careful movements. A woman slowly reclaiming the pieces of herself that she had given away. Colleen opened her own bank account, the first one in her name alone since before the wedding. Preston had insisted on joint finances. For simplicity, he'd said. For unity. Now she saw it for what it was. Control. She deposited a small transfer from her inheritance. Not enough to raise suspicion. Just enough to start. She began documenting. Every cruel comment, every financial manipulation, every time she asked for something reasonable and was denied. 6 years of memories, written down in a notebook she kept at her mother's house. The patterns were clearer on paper. The way Preston isolated her from her own friends. The way Victoria undermined her confidence. The way the whole family worked together to keep her small. Roz came over one evening with Chinese takeout and a bottle of sparkling cider. Talk to me, her best friend said. And I mean really talk. Not that polite, surface conversation you've been doing. So Colleen talked. For hours. Everything came pouring out. The inheritance, the condition, the investigation into the Blackwoods. The realization that her marriage had been a business arrangement from the start. Roz listened, without interrupting. When Colleen finally finished, her friend sat in silence for a long moment. I've been biting my tongue for 6 years, Roz finally said. Watching you shrink, watching you apologize for existing, watching you become someone I barely recognized. Why didn't you say anything? Because you weren't ready to hear it. Because every time I tried, you defended them, made excuses, said it wasn't that bad. Roz's eyes were fierce. But you're ready now. I can see it. I'm terrified. Good. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing scary things anyway. Colleen looked around her mother's kitchen, the familiar space that had become her sanctuary, the place where she was slowly remembering who she was. What if I fail? What if you don't? Roz leaned forward. What if you walk away from those people and build something beautiful? What if your daughter grows up watching her mother be brave instead of watching her mother shrink? Colleen's hand went to her belly. The baby kicked, strong, insistent, demanding to be noticed. I want her to be proud of me, Colleen whispered. I want her to know that her mother fought for her, for both of us. Then fight. You have every resource in the world. Use them. The next step was harder. Colleen met with Garrett Sullivan again, this time to understand the full picture of the Blackwood finances. What he revealed was worse than she had imagined. Preston Blackwood Jr.'s firm has been courting Hayes Technologies for years, Garrett said, trying to secure investment to cover massive debts. How massive? Tens of millions. The estate is mortgaged 3 times over. The investment firm is hemorrhaging money. The lifestyle they maintain is funded entirely by credit and reputation. Colleen thought of the gala, the champagne, the crystal chandeliers, all of it borrowed, all of it fake. Your mother rejected their proposals every time, Garrett continued. She knew exactly who they were, what they wanted. They married me hoping to access her money. That's my assessment, yes. They suspected your family had hidden resources. They gambled that patience would pay off. The anger that had been building for weeks crystallized into something sharp and clear. They had taken 6 years of her life, had married her under false pretenses, had treated her as a means to an end, and they had failed. Her mother had been too clever, too protective, too careful. Now Colleen had the power, all of it, and they didn't even know. She looked at her wedding ring. The diamond Preston had presented with such ceremony. She remembered thinking it was beautiful, remembered feeling chosen. Now she saw it clearly. A claim, a brand, a symbol of ownership disguised as love. What happens to the company if the Blackwoods get access to the money? She asked. Honestly, they'd strip it for parts, sell off the profitable divisions, fire thousands of employees, destroy everything your mother built to pay off their debts. That won't happen. No, Garrett agreed. It won't. She began packing that night. Zavolify carefully, taking only what was truly hers. The books Preston had called clutter. The photographs of her mother, the baby blanket she had finished from her mother's last project. Roz helped her move things to her mother's house, small loads in the trunk of her car, nothing that would raise suspicion. You're not running away, Roz said. You're walking toward yourself. Colleen nodded. The distinction mattered. She wasn't fleeing in shame or defeat. She was making a choice. A deliberate, empowered choice. 3 days before her due date, everything was ready. The accounts were separate. The documents were organized. The support system was in place. All that remained was the goodbye. Preston found her in the hallway of the Blackwood estate. Her suitcase by the door. His face cycled through confusion, then anger, then something she had never seen before. Fear. What is this? I'm leaving. You can't leave. You're days away from giving birth to my child. Our child. And I can leave. I'm choosing to leave. He moved toward her. She stepped back. The space between them felt charged with 6 years of unspoken truths. Is this about the baby shower? About what my mother said at the gala? We can fix that. I'll talk to her. This isn't about the baby shower, or the gala, or any single thing. Colleen kept her voice steady. This is about 6 years of being treated as less than human. That's ridiculous. We've given you everything. You've given me nothing. You've taken my confidence, my identity, my belief in myself. You've chipped away at everything that made me who I was until I couldn't remember what I looked like whole. Preston's expression hardened. The mask was slipping now. You're being dramatic, hysterical. This is hormones talking. This is clarity talking. For the first time in 6 years. The front door opened. Victoria and Preston Jr. entered, returning from lunch at the club. They froze at the scene. What's happening? Victoria demanded. Colleen is having some kind of breakdown, Preston said. She thinks she's leaving. I don't think. I know. Victoria's eyes went to the suitcase. To Colleen's steady hands and calm expression, something shifted in her face. Think about what you're throwing away, the older woman said. The security, the name, the life your child would have. What will people think? I don't care what people think anymore. I care what my daughter thinks when she's old enough to understand what kind of marriage I modeled for her. Sloane appeared on the staircase. She must have heard the raised voices. Her expression was strange, almost hopeful. Victoria tried another approach. Her voice softened. Colleen, dear, I know I can be difficult, but everything I've done has been to help you, to refine you, to make you worthy of this family. Worthy? Colleen laughed. The sound was sharp. That's the problem, Victoria. I was never unworthy. I was never less than. You just needed me to believe I was so you could control me. Preston grabbed her arm. His grip was tight, too tight. You're not leaving. Not with my child. Colleen looked down at his hand, then back at his face. Let go of me. I said, you're not leaving. And I said, let go. Her voice was ice, calm, absolute. Something in her expression made him release her arm. He stepped back. Sloane spoke from the staircase. Just tell her the truth. Tell her why you really married her. Silence. Victoria hissed at her daughter. Be quiet. No, I'm tired of being quiet. I'm tired of pretending this family is something it isn't. Sloane came down the stairs. She deserves to know. Preston's face drained of color. Sloane, stop. Tell her about the investigation, about the marriage plan, about how you specifically targeted her because you thought her family had hidden money. Colleen turned to her husband. Her voice was steady. Tell me. And he did, haltingly, furiously, as if she had somehow wronged him by asking. The arrangement, the research into potential heirs, the belief that Colleen's mother might have hidden assets, the gamble that if they were kind enough, patient enough, they'd eventually access whatever was there. 6 years. She had given them 6 years. And it had all been a lie. When Preston finished, Colleen picked up her suitcase. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. I'm going to tell you something my mother never got to tell you. She looked at each of them in turn. Victoria with her careful makeup and her crumbling empire. Preston Jr. with his failing firm and his borrowed prestige. Preston with his handsome face and his hollow heart. And Sloane, who had finally told the truth, even if it was too late to matter. I'm worth $100 billion, and you will never see a penny of it. She walked out the door. The drive to her mother's house took 23 minutes. She didn't cry, didn't rage, didn't feel anything except a strange lightness. A weight lifted, a prison door opened. 3 days later, she filed for divorce, and then she went into labor. The delivery room was bright and sterile and filled with machines that beeped and hummed. Colleen gripped the bed rails and breathed through another contraction. Roz was there, holding her hand. You're doing amazing. Keep going, doctor. Crane's voice was calm, reassuring. Almost there. One more push. Colleen pushed. Her whole body shook with the effort, with the pain, with the overwhelming reality of bringing a life into the world. And then, a cry. Sharp and strong and furious. The most beautiful sound she had ever heard. A girl, Dr. Crane said. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. They placed her on Colleen's chest, tiny and red and screaming, wrinkled face and clenched fists and a voice that demanded to be heard. Hello, Margaret, Colleen whispered. I've been waiting for you. The baby stopped crying. Her eyes, dark and unfocused, seemed to search for something, found her mother's face, settled. I'm Colleen, she continued. Your mama. And I promise you right now, I will never let anyone make you feel small. I will never let anyone tell you you're not enough. You are everything. You're the beginning and the end and everything in between. The tears came then, not sad, not afraid, just overwhelmingly present. This was her daughter, her legacy, her reason. The days after the birth were a blur of feedings and diaper changes and sleepless nights. Colleen moved into her mother's house permanently, filled it with baby things and flowers and the warmth of chosen family. Roz came over every day with food and support and terrible jokes that made Colleen laugh until she cried. Eleanor visited for the first time, meeting her great-granddaughter with trembling hands and tears streaming down her face. She looks like Margaret, the old woman whispered, like both of them. Walter stopped by with papers to sign and gentle reassurance. Take your time. The company isn't going anywhere. Neither is the money. Focus on your daughter. Dr. Crane made a house call to check on both patients. You're healing well. Both of you. Keep doing what you're doing. Even Garrett Sullivan sent flowers. A massive arrangement with a card that read, Welcome to the world, Margaret. Your grandmother would be so proud. The press conference happened a month later. Colleen sat behind a table in a conference room at Hayes Technologies, facing a sea of reporters and cameras. My name is Colleen Hayes, she began. I'm taking my mother's name because I want to honor her memory. Margaret Hayes lived simply by choice, but she built something extraordinary. A company that employs nearly 50,000 people worldwide. A foundation that supports education and healthcare and environmental protection. A legacy of good that touched millions of lives. She paused, breathed, felt the weight of the words she was about to say. I'm here today to announce that I will be taking an active role in guiding that legacy forward. Not because I need to, but because I want to. Because my mother believed that wealth is a tool, not an identity. Because I believe the same thing. Questions erupted about her mother, about the company, about her plans. She answered them calmly, honestly, without apologizing. Not once did she mention the Blackwoods. She didn't need to. The aftermath unfolded predictably. Preston's attempts to contest the divorce crumbled when his family's financial instability became public record. The estate was sold. The investment firm collapsed. The Blackwood name, which had been everything, suddenly meant nothing. Sloane, surprisingly, reached out, not as an enemy, but as someone who also wanted out. I married into this family because I thought it was my only option, she said over coffee. You're proof there are other paths. You could walk away. I'm starting to think I should. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was something, a connection built on honesty instead of pretense. One evening, Colleen sat in her mother's kitchen, her kitchen now, with Margaret sleeping in her arms. The baby's face was peaceful. Perfect. Everything Colleen had ever wanted without knowing she wanted it. The back door opened. Roz let herself in, as she had taken to doing. Big day tomorrow? Ready for the board meeting? Not even slightly. Good. Being ready is overrated. Roz poured herself some tea and sat down across the table. How are you really doing? Colleen considered the question. 6 months ago, she had been dying inside, married to a man who saw her as furniture, surrounded by people who treated her as less than. Now she was a mother, a business owner, a woman building a life on her own terms. I'm terrified, she admitted, but it's a different kind of terror now, not the helpless kind, the exciting kind, like standing at the edge of something vast and choosing to jump. Your mother would be proud. I hope so. I'm trying to be worthy of her, of what she built, of the choice she made. Margaret stirred, made a small sound, settled back into sleep. Colleen looked at her daughter's face and understood something she hadn't fully grasped before. Her mother hadn't hidden the money to deprive her. She had hidden it so Colleen would learn to survive without it, would learn her own strength, would know who she was before she had the power to become someone else. It was the greatest gift she had ever received. The phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Hi, I'm sorry to bother you. I saw your press conference. My mother-in-law, well, it's a long story, but you made me feel like maybe I'm not as trapped as I thought. I just wanted to say thank you. Colleen stared at the message, at the hope encoded in those simple words. Her mother had built something from nothing, had helped people without anyone knowing, had created a legacy of quiet good. Now it was Colleen's turn. She typed her response. You're not trapped, you never were. You just haven't found the door yet. Keep looking, it's there, I promise. She hit send, set down the phone, looked around the kitchen that had held so many memories, so many secrets, so much love. Her mother's recipe for apple pie was still taped inside the spice cabinet. Cinnamon, 2 teaspoons. Nutmeg, ½ teaspoon. Love, unlimited. Colleen smiled. Her daughter slept. Outside, the sun was setting over a world full of possibility. She wasn't the same woman who had stood at her mother's funeral 8 months ago. Wasn't the wife who had apologized for existing. Wasn't the daughter who hadn't known her own mother. She was someone new, someone built from grief and courage and the stubborn refusal to stay small. She was Colleen Hayes. Mother, business owner, survivor, and she was just getting started. If this story touched your heart, if you've ever felt unseen or undervalued, you're not alone. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that reminds you of your strength. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever walked away from something that was making you smaller? I'd love to hear your story. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message today, share this video with them. Sometimes a single story can change everything. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Your support means the world to this channel. Closing statement. This content has been carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring meaningful stories and valuable life lessons to our audience. Every word is crafted with intention, because you deserve content that matters.